So thank you all for coming. If you're going to be in politics, you probably should get over a fear of public speaking. That's all I'll say, since I don't care. But I just want to thank everybody for coming and thank our sponsoring groups for this event today, sent to us by Move to Amend. Most of you are familiar at least a little bit with the organization, and if not, or even if you are and want to learn more, there's a great table of materials over there that tells you more about the organization. We'll be taking names of anyone interested. We have a number of supporting groups here. We're supported today by the Veterans for Peace, Local 161, Johnson County Greens, the Poor People's Campaign of Iowa, and Eastern Iowa Move to Amend, which is actually not officially Move to Amend, but we're a supporting group. So I just want to thank everyone for coming, and you can see our panelists for yourself on the program. I want to introduce Greg Coleridge. He is the Move to Amend Outreach Director. He spent 3 decades as a member of the American Friends Service Committee and is still on the board of POCLAD. That's the Project on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, which has been around for 25 years, yes. So another excellent organization and kind of a precursor almost to Move to Amend. So thank you, Outreach Director Greg Coleridge. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you ever so much for showing up today. Just wanted to thank Dawn Jones so much for her effort in helping organize this and to reaching out and collaborating, if not conspiring, with some of the rest of you to put this event together. And I am particularly mighty impressed that all of you would be here on a Sunday afternoon in the holiday season, right? When you could very easily be doing a lot of other things that are a whole lot more fun, quite frankly, than hearing about corporate rule, corporate power, money in elections, and all the horrific impacts that big money in elections and the super duper rich and corporate entities have had and caused economically, socially, politically, environmentally, morally, all of the above, and other things I have mentioned. You know, you could be out, I don't know, going to the mall. You could be stringing lights. You could be, I don't know, making fruitcake, for heaven's sake. You could be doing any of those things, but you have chosen to be here, and so for that, I am mighty grateful. Thank you very much. And thanks to the sponsors. Thanks so much for Robin in the back for taping this. He may and you may at the end of today regret that happening and being here, but hopefully not. I look forward to, after babbling at you for a few minutes, to have some others come up, share their experiences, and then we can certainly go at it and cuss and discuss these issues and how issues around corporate rule and money in politics affects issues and peoples and communities right here in eastern Iowa and beyond, because this is as much a local issue as it is a global issue, or as some say, a glocal issue, right? It sort of spans the gamut. Just wanted to make sure that everyone has both this piece of information, the flyer, Move to Amend, as well as this sheet here that sort of looks at corporate constitutional rights that is beyond the First Amendment political, because I'm going to make reference to both of those. And hopefully going around is a sign-in sheet that we can capture. And please do sign, and I promise at least to wait a couple of months before I turn it over to the NSA. So, not right away. So, as mentioned, I used to work for an outfit called the American Friends Service Committee. Maybe some of you have heard of that, a social action organization that works, still does, 101st year on peace, justice, humanitarian concerns. And about 10 years into that effort, I got invited by a friend of mine who was a former city council person in Toledo, Ohio. I am from Ohio, Buckeye State, and had worked about 10 years into the American Friends Service Committee. Got invited to this workshop, weekend workshop, sponsored by this outfit called POCLAD, the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, which was a group of frustrated activists, I would say. Labor activists, consumer activists, environmental activists, a variety of other activists who sort of while coming from different backgrounds, shared a common feature of, physical feature, I would say. That being that one side of their heads was flatter than the other side. And that was because they were pounding their heads against the wall perpetually, trying to get a success in working on whatever issue it was, but realizing that they were not as effective as they once were and those before them had been. Because there was something, and that I shared that fact, though my head was still more or less round, not as flat as it is now, and had a bit more hair then as well. But shared this reality of sort of the political equivalent of something called the law of diminishing returns. Ever hear that term? Law of diminishing returns, meaning that over time, the more effort you put into something, one unit of effort, you're getting less back of a return on that investment of time, energy, and resources. And that certainly described, I think, accurately what I was feeling, becoming more and more frustrated at trying to achieve some degree of success in stopping, with what I was doing with the American Friends Service Committee, trying to stop this war, that weapon system, this toxic dump, this violation of human rights abuses, you name it. That there was just simply a whole lot of investing of energy that over time that we were getting not far enough and not fast enough. And that we were being stymied. And that as those folks in POCLAD were helping us understand, the reason for that was not inherently that we were any less effective in activism as our forebears had been, but that those forms of traditional activism of, well, you know the drill, right? Showing up to meetings, calling our legislators, bringing out people who are disaffected from the community and having them testify before public officials. You know, doing all of this, showing up to public hearings dressed as chickens or whales or whatever the case may be to try to make the point. That all of those things were becoming less and less effective, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that, as people say, the system was not broken, but rather it was fixed, as in rigged, to benefit a very few number of people, that being the 1%ers, but also certain entities, those being corporations, corporate entities. And while those were the winners, the rest of us were the losers, and those we worked with and tried to represent. And so this group of frustrated activists were going around the country and doing what they called rethinks, rethinking democracy and rethinking the corporation, and helping us come to some understanding of how we got into this mess. And that was sort of an aha experience for me, and understanding that what's going on today in terms of the privatization or corporatization of, well, you fill in the blank, is not inevitable, is not irreversible. In fact, it was not meant to be. That the original story of the relationship between people and corporations of today is very different than how at one time it once was. And so I'll get into that a little later, but that's sort of how I got into this. And in working as I did then, I sort of reshifted a lot of my work with the American Friends Service Committee to begin looking at these two issue areas of money and politics, which was one of the ways that the system was fixed, and corporate governance. Not just corporations being involved in sort of economic matters, but in ruling, in governing, in being a part of fundamental decisions that affect our lives, those of our neighbors, those of our families, those in our communities, as well as, well, whatever amount of the natural world we have left. And so that's sort of what led me then to do this work that was well before Move to Amend came about. Of course, Move to Amend did come about in 2010. If you look over at this timeline put together by a number of national groups, including the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and a few others, you will see that on the far right, 2010 is when Citizens United was passed, that expanded the ability of the 1%ers and of corporate entities to exert their political influence in donating or investing in political campaigns. but that these powers and these rights preceded that by a very, very long time. But Move to Amend got its start, basically, among sort of a second round of frustrated activists, seeing what was about to take place by those guys and a couple of gals on the court at that time, and realized that this was not going to be a very pretty picture, and that we needed to organize to sort of be ready if and when this decision comes down not our way, but to sort of use that as an opportunity to say we need to develop a movement, a democracy movement that must be intergenerational, must be diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, must be politically and economically independent. Politically, we're talking about not connected to a political party. Can't be. And by financially, can't be connected to a political party. Can't be connected to big foundations. Can't be connected to corporations. Can't be connected to government, because all of those have strings attached. And better to be small and independent, where you can do some serious mischief making, than it is if you have basically sold out. Because that is how, in the past, so many movements that get going and get started authentically and legitimately, in the end get co-opted. And that has happened an awful lot of the time. So Move to Amend got started with those basic principles, that we need to have a movement that focuses on not simply, there are other people out there doing some good work in trying to focus on the electoral arena, right? In trying to elect or unelect people. That's important. And while it's important to have people involved in the legislative and regulatory arenas, where we have good statutes, good laws that are passed and get rid of rotten laws, good regulations that are passed and get rid of bad regulations or no regulations, that while it's important to be involved in both of those arenas, we cannot and should not ignore the constitutional arena. It's extremely important that we focus at least some of our energy there, because that, my friends, is where the fundamental rulemaking is. That we can focus on, if you will, the analogy of trying to change the players of the game. That's what elected officials are. And the plays of the game, that's what the rules, or that's what the laws and regulations are. But if the rules of the game are stacked against us, then you can have the best players on a team who sort of do and make the best plays, right? They're excellent at executing their basketball plays or football plays, whatever. But if one team, say basketball, has a basket that's twice or three times the diameter than the other team, who's going to win that game? The rules were fixed and have been for a very long time. So we can't ignore that arena. And so Move to Amend focuses on the constitutional arena, to say that we need to amend the Constitution. And the two features of it, go to this piece again, and here we go. I don't think you came in late, but you may have picked this up. But if you open up that trifold, here you have what it is that we are trying to do. So as a group that's been around now since the Citizens United decision of January 2010, hard to believe that next month will be the 9th bloody anniversary of this decision, 5-4. Here we have this, what we call the We the People Amendment, that has two features. Radical concept, section 1, right? Radical. That only human beings, natural persons, should have constitutional rights. Right? Only natural persons. And second, that basically people are people. And that's it. If you aren't a person, you shouldn't have inalienable constitutional rights. Constitutional rights were intended to apply exclusively and specifically and solely to human beings. The Bill of Rights was intended not for corporate entities, but for human beings. The 14th Amendment, not for corporate entities, but for human beings. So this would basically go back to, at one time, what the original intent is. You know, corporations, they're not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. Nowhere. So that's that piece of it, Section 1. Section 2, just as radical, right? That money is not political free speech. My friends, money is property. Money is property, just like the coat on your back, the car or vehicle, bike you may drive or move around in, or the crown jewels you have somewhere hidden in your basement or attic or somewhere else. Those are forms of property. So is money. If money is speech, then those who have the most money, guess what? Have the most speech. Not a real good definition, I would say, of anything approaching an authentic, whatever you want to call it, and take your pick, depending on what your political persuasion is, might be democracy, sovereignty, self-determination, self-governance, right to decide, whatever that descriptor is. Basically, we don't have much of that if money is defined as speech and corporations are defined as persons. So that's what this entails, a constitutional amendment that we believe, by it being enacted, and for those of you who don't remember from Government 101 in 11th or 12th grade, basically the drill is you can have a constitutional amendment become the law of the land in one of two ways. Either by getting 2/3 of each branch of Congress, Senate and House, to pass, and then it goes to the states, where 3/4 by simple majority of the state legislatures have to ratify. That's the one way. The other, under Article 5, calls for a convention that would be specific to whatever is brought up. Now, people get freaked out by the whole idea of a constitutional convention, and we're not for that approach as of now. But the truth of the matter is that what that calls for is a very specific constitutional convention that would be, you know, if it was called for this, it could be just for this. And if those folks, once the doors are closed and locked, try to come up with, I don't know, balanced budget amendment or trying to ditch the Bill of Rights, you know, they're not supposed to do that. But if they did, again, it would still have to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. So even if you did an end run around Congress through that approach, you still would have to get 3/4. We're not calling for that. However, it should be said that some of the 20th century, amendments to the Constitution, that there were movements out there that threatened this amendment, constitutional amendment or constitutional convention approach. So things like the 17th Amendment, that if you recall in the original Constitution, the Senate was appointed by state legislators. Lots of corruption associated with that. 17th Amendment said, no, we want to shift that and have direct election. Really radical concept, right? Have we the people elect our senators. Congress was disinclined to do that until state after state passed at the state level calling for a constitutional convention for that. So that threat, imminent threat, they were just a couple states short of actually calling for that. Then that put the fire under the feet of Congress to do that. Same with the poll tax, elimination of that, which was 23rd Amendment, something along those lines. Same thing associated with that, and a couple of others. That same sort of threat. So Move to Amend is not calling for that. We're calling for the sort of traditional way that up to this point we have achieved an amendment. So that's what it is we're trying to do. I just want to take a minute or two here to talk about some of what it is that when we talk about money as speech, what does that mean? And when we talk about corporations as persons, what does that mean? And then we'll bring the panel up and again, we can hear some reactions and then go at it. All right, so the money is speech part. This is the more familiar part, right, of Move to Amend, the Section 2, that political money would no longer be deemed as free speech, but would be, the opportunity would be for we the people to regulate money in elections. So that may take the form of, we want no public money in elections. We want all, full public financing. So that would be something to cuss and discuss at the legislative level, at the local, state, or federal. Or maybe we want a blending of some public, some private. The point is, this has no specific mandate of what that specific post-28th Amendment or 28th Amendment would say. All it's saying is that this should not be a decision made up by the courts. This should be a decision made by we the people. So let's put it back. Let's move it back where it once was, from the judicial arena to the legislative arena, and have legislators decide. Or we directly decide through doing an end run, and if your state has a citizen initiative process, then you at the state level could create some system whereby we're calling at the state level for XYZ, ABC. Money of speech did not originate with Citizens United. That actually originated with the Buckley versus Vallejo 1976 decision, where, again, just as with just as much controversy, 5-4 decision. That's where it started. Citizens United was sort of the next phase in it that expanded money being defined as speech, and corporations having more of a free-for-all, although technically, that case was not decided on either one of those fronts. There were two issues that it was decided on: the right to listen, and corporations being nothing more than a collection, an association of people. That's what the actual decision was based on, not on money, speech, or corporations as persons. But the effect was that much more money came in to elections from individuals and corporate entities, with lots of horrific implications that we all have seen, right, through the attack ads that have since come, largely through the so-called wink, wink, nod, nod independent expenditures. And there have been all sorts of impacts associated with that we could spend a lot of time going over, that I don't want to sort of take time here. We can maybe, I can elaborate a bit in the question and answer. But I want to spend a couple minutes to talk about that second piece, because the second piece really doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And if we are going to be change agents in promoting this or promoting anything that is remotely similar to this, we have to get on the other side of the learning curve and understand what corporate constitutional rights is. It is a lot more than political free speech rights, okay? That a decision in 1978 called First National Bank versus Bellotti is the first time corporations won or were anointed with First Amendment rights to be involved in elections. That was initiatives. And from there, it just became more and more where they won rights to be involved in elections. But a lot of people think that when we talk about corporate personhood, that that's the totality of corporate constitutional rights. And it isn't. That corporations have, over the decades, over the scores of years, over more than a century, have won other equally never intended, inalienable constitutional rights. And that's where this comes in. 1819, Dartmouth College versus Woodward. They win contractual rights in which a contract, it's called the sort of perversion. There's lots of ways that corporations have perverted the Constitution and constitutional rights. Dartmouth College versus Woodward was perverting the contracts clause, where they said a contract is actually a charter is nothing more than a contract. Because some of the original definition and control and democratization from day one of corporations by we the people was through this thing called a corporate charter. It was a democratic instrument issued by the state legislatures. They were issued one at a time for specific purposes that limited the ability of corporations to do basically what the charter said. And the charter of corporations, listed, here's what you can do. And I still can't figure out why, in particular, it was very specific on a certain type of corporations, namely banks. Can't imagine why. Banking corporations were particularly under fear that they might become too big for their corporate britches. But they were. So that was a problem right from the start, in which corporations were defined not so much as through the charter as an instrument of control, though they still were able to, but not as much control as they once were. 1886, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. It's a complicated story, but the point is that this was sort of the first time that corporations won Bill of Rights and civil rights protections, this being the 14th Amendment. If you remember, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were the post-Civil War amendments to grant free black slaves certain rights, end of slavery. 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection. 15th Amendment, right to vote. 14th Amendment was intended exclusively, solely for free black slaves. With a straight face, corporate attorneys went into court and said, it also applies to us. And the courts at that time, made up of railroad attorneys, including the head of it, a guy named Morrison Wade, who I'm ashamed to say was from Ohio, that's where I'm from, sort of bought it, looked the other way, and there's a backstory to it, but the point is, that's kind of where it first began. 3 years later, Minnesota, in 1889, Minnesota versus St. Louis Railroad in Beckwith is where it became very legitimate. That corporations had won due process and equal protection. And 14th Amendment, what that meant is the impact of that is that right up to the present time, there have been dozens of instances of times where local municipalities will pass a law that says, let's give preferential treatment to local businesses over, chain stores, IBM, whatever the case may be. Or let's try to prevent a cell phone tower from coming in, whatever the case may be. And the corpses go into court and saying, you are discriminating against me, the big box store or whatever, because that's violating our 14th Amendment constitutional rights. Courts have gone along with that. So a real horrific perversion of that amendment. Hale versus Henkel, 1906, corporations win 4th Amendment search and seizure protection. So you can no longer, after that point, have surprise inspections. That was able to occur beforehand. Thus, workers trying to ensure that there's a safe workplace. Or environmental conditions. Maybe a corporation is dumping stuff. OSHA could no longer come in after that fact. And all sorts of egregious things have occurred since then that have prevented these surprise inspections. So when you get a warning, warrant's been issued, they sort of get 24, 48 hours, whatever the case may be, they have a chance to sort of clean up their act. Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mahon, 1922, perversion of the 5th Amendment. 5th Amendment is considered the takings clause. And this was the first time that a regulation was deemed a taking. So in this case, how can naive these people in Pennsylvania be? The state of Pennsylvania passed a law saying that if a coal company mines, they shouldn't mine underneath people's homes because it can result in homes collapsing. So there was a regulation, an act passed that regulated that. Company goes to court, they sue, and they say this is a threat, and this is a violation of my 5th Amendment takings rights, which means that if you want that law to stand, you have to give me the current as well as potentially the future profits that I'm going to lose. And the court went along with that. So how many communities could afford, if it's a coal company, if it's a natural gas company, if it's, you fill in the blank, hundreds, millions or hundreds of thousands more to compensate for a company. International Dairy Foods Association versus Amsoy. This is an example of First Amendment rights, but First Amendment rights not to speak. In this case, again, the naive people of Vermont thought that they could pass a law and that it would hold to say, not even prohibiting bovine growth hormones, just simply saying, we want this stuff to be labeled. We should have the right to know that our citizens, our consumers, should have the right to know what's in dairy products. How foolish of them to expect that they could get away with that. The company went to court, said, that's violating my First Amendment right not to speak. So the right of the corporation not to disclose what's in the food preempted, or dare I say, trumped, the right of citizens to know what's in the food they eat. So never mind the police power of a community to protect the health, safety, welfare, and morals of that community. First Amendment, free speech rights. Not on here is Commerce Clause. Commerce Clause is the ability to challenge a law at a local or particularly state level that is considered to be a trade barrier. And there have been many instances, including, and we can get into it when we talk about it, a number of examples right here in Iowa, that over time, when people had the audacity at the state level to try to prevent the sale of alcohol that comes from out of state, to say, no, we don't want alcohol, or we don't want gambling, or we don't want farmers who don't own the land, hog farmers, producers that are out of state. That goes back to a decision, when was it? Maybe some of you know, 1975. People of Iowa took action to protect family farmers and the communities dependent upon them, and they passed a law making it illegal for a pork processing corporation to own and raise hogs in the state, trying to get only local people to own it. Went to court. Under the Commerce Clause, it was thrown out. Even though over time, from 1975 until it was challenged, people at the state level and state legislatures were updating this law and passing stuff unanimously. Never mind. Your right to decide is bogus compared to the corporation's rights of the Commerce Clause. I'll just end here on this point by saying this. If you remember nothing about the babbling of what I've said, nothing, but one thing, it is this, that the combination of the Commerce Clause and the 14th Amendment, okay, those two things together, have been usurped, preempted, trumped, whatever your adjective is, captured, hijacked by corporate entities a couple of hundred times that have overturned democratically enacted laws at the state level, protecting workers, consumers, communities, sometimes the natural world. And why that's important to know is that we could wake up tomorrow morning and Citizens United could be gone. We could wake up tomorrow morning and Buckley versus Vallejo could be reversed, saying money is not free speech. If we got rid of both of those, either one or even both, and there are some groups out there that are focusing on just those. Let's just reverse Citizens United so that we can go back to the grand, glorious democratic nirvana that we had the day before. Remember those days? I don't, because we didn't have them. We had problems that were horrific beforehand with harms to people in the environment and communities then. This is just maybe the latest chapter and the most egregious. They got too greedy because corporate constitutional rights were sort of anointed one sort of slim, salami piece at a time. They went for a big chunk. We could get rid of all of those, but we would still have all of these other never intended inalienable constitutional rights, including 14th Amendment, Commerce Clause. I didn't even mention the First Amendment right of religion. Remember that decision, Hobby Lobby, 2014, in which not the human beings of Hobby Lobby, but the corporation was deemed as having a right of conscience to deny the employees contraceptive coverage because it was against the morality of the corporation under a federal statute. So it didn't exactly go after First Amendment right of religion. But again, if corporations don't have just political free speech rights or money being defined as free speech, they'll just simply go back to the anti-democratic hammers that they have used, abused, misused for a long time. That's defined here, which is why Move to Amend says we have got to abolish all never intended inalienable rights. Toward that end, I'll just simply add and end by saying we're trying to build a movement, as I mentioned before, that's democratic internally, that's focusing on external democracy, that has got to be multicultural, has got to be intergenerational, has got to be financially and politically independent. Not an easy thing. And particularly focusing on something that seems like it's a heavy lift. And it is a heavy lift right now when there's so much good work that is doing the R's. Responding, resisting, reacting to all of those things out there that are threats right here and right now. And we have to continue to respond, react, and resist to those harms. If the building is on fire, you got to put out the fire. If people are drowning downstream, you got to pull them out downstream. But at some point, don't we at least a little bit need to divert some of our attention upstream to say, how are those people getting into the water to begin with? How and who are the arsonists that are lighting the fire in those buildings? We have to focus on systemic change. Systemic change. Focusing on just simply the Band-Aid downstream. While that's important, it's got to be connected and contextualized with the systemic. Finally, I don't know about you. I can only speak for myself. But I see what's going on out there concerning the environment and what we are doing to it. Destroying our own habitat. The everything bubble economically now, where debt exists at personal level, auto loan, student loan, municipal, you name it. All the legacy costs, how the hell are we going to pay for, I was just in Illinois. They got something like $200 billion in debt. One friggin' state. How the hell are we going to pay for that? This stuff is unsustainable. This stuff is going to reach a tipping point. Politically, you think we can continue to have a system where we spend more and more money, where we have, more of a disconnect between what we want and the kind of policies we don't get? How sustainable is that? Constitutionally, look at the disconnect that's going on. There's disconnects, and there are things that are just simply not sustainable. It's going to reach a tipping point. And any one of those could trigger a number of the other categories. I just don't see, realistically, how we cannot at least spend some time focusing on, this is just the beginning, of the kind of fundamental change I believe we need. There's a Chinese saying that says you are likely to end up where you were headed. Where are we headed? It's not a pretty picture. We're working on trying to create a movement. We have 60-some affiliates around the country, 450,000 people that have signed the petition. It's going around the sign-in sheet. 700 communities that have passed either by municipal resolution or ballot initiative calling for this. 65 people in the House that have endorsed this, the We the People Amendment, being introduced in the Senate. So, I ask you, and I'll pass around a volunteer form here to ask you to whatever extent you can to help us in whatever way, in terms of human energy, in terms of support, financial support, whatever the case may be. Do what you can. We can't do it alone. It's got to be with all of us together. What form eventually that takes, what timetable. We have a 10-year plan. Not very many other groups do. It's in the back. Pick one up on your way out. Let's figure out how to do this. We have no idea. We're building the bicycle as we ride it. It's exciting. It's terrifying. But let's figure out how we can do this together. So, yeah.
Legalese is so damned intentionally confusing. Has the wording of the proposal been scanned by people who are familiar with legalese? Because as of something like 1862, corporations were persons and human beings were monsters. So you really need to have someone who is familiar with legalese evaluate that. Ralph Nader says that you need about 6 times as many people as 500,000. Because he says you need about 1% of the population, putting the 550 congresspersons' feet to the fire in order to get this done.
Right.
And getting 1% of the people aware of the problem, the real problem. Because you're right, the system isn't broken, it's perfectly well fixed. That's doing exactly what the people who wanted to do.
Right.
More so since 2010.
Right.
So,
yeah, we have had this language, what's the term, vetted. This is not so much a legal problem as it is a political one. Let's be real, friends. We have to build power. Every movement in the past has built power. Women's movements, right, 1848 Women's Rights Convention to 1920. How long did that take? 72 years because of my twit face? It ain't going to take that long with social media. But it will take a period of time, and again, with these external existential crises, some of which, I think that either this happens or we go completely fascist and downhill.
I
So,
agree.
we'll see. All right, why don't we call up others now who are on this panel to share their views, insights, perspectives. And by the way, I just wanted to thank you. I always appreciate the opportunity to stand while everyone else sits, because it's the only way I can see people eye to eye, so I appreciate that. Thank you. But now I will be sitting, so you probably will not see me.
Personal request, I didn't bring my hearing aids today, so when people answer questions, would they speak up nice and loudly for me?
Sure, and you need this to be, is that right, passed around? So why don't we start here? Introduce yourself, who you are, and what you have to say, 5 minutes, right? Is that the idea, I think?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Mike Carberry. I currently am the chairperson of the Johnson County Board of Supervisors. I'm really honored to be here. This is an issue that I've worked on for a long time. I have been a professional environmental advocate since Al Gore ruined my life in the year 2000, when I was just basically a political activist, and I read a book called Earth in the Balance, and it was the first time I'd ever heard about global warming, and so I stopped being an antique dealer and worked my way into being a professional environmental advocate. But I found pretty soon after I got involved that, as Greg said, the system isn't broken, it's fixed. And what I found was that we have the best political system that money can buy. And I mean the last 4 words are the most important, that money can buy. Because what I found is that our system, our political system, both at the state and the federal level, is basically bought and paid for by the highest bidder. And on the federal level, that's the fossil fuel industries, mostly led by the Koch brothers. And at the state level, that is probably the Iowa Farm Bureau. And so the Iowa Farm Bureau is probably the most powerful force in Iowa politics, because nothing passes at the State House that they don't allow to have passed. They will sit on the sidelines on some bills that don't affect them and let them pass. But the Farm Bureau is the only group, maybe the rural electric co-ops, that can get rural Democrats to vote almost every time like a Republican, because they're afraid that the Farm Bureau will put up money against them and a competitor, and they'll lose their seat. And that's kind of what happened to me. That's why I won't be a county supervisor after the first of the year, because the Iowa Farm Bureau, through me speaking out about the evils of the Farm Bureau and how they're an insurance company that really cares about agribusiness and they're not a friend of the farm or the farmer or of the people, and the CAFO issue. And so they put up a lot of money and support behind an opponent of mine. And, even in the People's Republic of Johnson County, I was able to, well, I guess maybe I was too liberal for Johnson County. And so, I guess the golden rule is that those with the most gold make the rules. And we need to change that. I mean, we really need to return democracy back to the people and make our democracy about leadership and ideas and not about money. And one of the worst things that I saw happen in the last year, other than me losing my job, was the Democrats put up a candidate that put $3.5 million of his own money into the primary, and then over $4 million into his general election, and he got beat. Now, maybe if that hadn't been allowed, then maybe the Democrats would have had a different candidate for governor, one that maybe was more personable, maybe one that spoke more to rural issues and to middle class issues and a few other things. So I will continue to fight this. One of the things I've always thought, and the environment has always been, I've always said, was my number 1 issue, but I've also said that really it should be my number 2 issue, that until we get the money out of politics, we'll never get what we want. So getting the money out of politics probably should be all our number one issue. And then whatever our second issue is, if it's women's rights, if it's Medicare for all, if it's the environment, fighting CAFOs, the thing that you're fighting for the most, you need to change to be able to get those victories. You've got to get the money out of politics first. That's what I got. You bet.
My turn.
Was that close to 5 minutes, Maureen?
It was. You're good.
Well done. Didn't even need this. I was getting ready for it, man.
She wanted to make sure she goes, Mike, 5 minutes. I love Maureen.
We've worked together a long time, just in case. My name is Maureen McHugh. For those of you who don't know me, I've been directing the Iowa chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility for about, 15, 18 years here in Iowa. We are a national and an international organization. I won't go into all of our organizational structure, but our main concerns are with climate and environmental degradation and militarism and the risk of a nuclear exchange, as well as environmental justice, because these are all of the existential threats that mean the end of life as we know it. And my most recent effort, and that's why I'm sitting here next to Mike and Greg on either side, is that we have been working on something called the People's Budget Process. We're really talking about what does money mean and who determines how money is spent. And it's just still in beginning stages, and we're obviously open to lots of suggestions, but it has been involving Sierra Club, the Science and Environmental Health Network, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which has already been mentioned as a strong supporter and involved agent in terms of the Move to Amend effort rather. And so what we're trying to look at is talking about budgets as the entities that reflect our values and reflect our philosophy of government. The government determines the budget determines the government in many ways. And so we are looking, we came together because we're all very concerned about the idea that public interest research at universities has been cut, that environmental protections are being cut all over the place, that our environment is affecting our health and will continue as we know the climate is changing very rapidly, as our environment is deteriorating very rapidly. And we need to look at infrastructure quality that's affecting our air, our water, our soil. And so we talked about what kind of solutions solve multiple problems, like the way the WPA restored the environment while providing jobs and improving the economy, by tying health insurance costs, for instance, to environmental quality. Even farmers' health insurance, which is a contentious issue for anybody in the farming community, have that be tied to the costs, their costs related to how they prevent pollution runoff. So basically, it's to balance the budget by creating a fair, equitable tax system and stopping corporate giveaways. How do we do that? What does that mean? Right now, we have a state government and a budget that believes that government is at the service of corporations. I mean, we've not only gone from arguing small areas, but rather we're now servicing corporations. Our government now wants to create a competitive business environment. Forget citizenship, forget our health, forget public well-being. So we want our budget to be democracy in action, to be the trustee of all of what we share, that the government has a fiduciary responsibility to support your health and my health, to support the commons, the roads, the air, the water, the cornerstones of that which makes our state, which makes all of us be able to survive, basically, to prioritize our environment. And we cannot continue to believe that it's corporations that drive our economic growth, that economic growth is the goal. The goal is to support all of us, public money for public goods in public hands, basically. To stop giving our money to corporations who are determining priorities that call for their own profit, not for us. We did put together a little sort of a fact sheet that I put at the back. It was designed initially to help people think about the elections, and we need to update it now that the elections have happened. Where can we begin to push the idea that budgets reflect our priorities, budgets reflect our notion of government? And we would be so happy to take your suggestions, to take your energy. I think we're very much focused on many of the same ends and goals. And I could go on, but I can't. My 5 minutes are up. Let's protect our water. Let's protect our air. Let's protect the commons. Let's work for fiduciary responsibility to all of us. We pay for the government. We are the government. Let's take it back through our budget process.
Thank you for, when I listen to someone like you talk, I realize that I know nothing, and it's kind of refreshing, that people are putting the amount of research and energy and organizing into Move to Amend, and we need this desperately. One of the things that, sorry?
Demita.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm Demita Brown, and I have been working with Midwest Telegraph and writing for a column for the paper, and kind of just like looking at media justice issues and anti-racism. So that's been where I put a lot of my energy in terms of, got a chance to direct Freedom School in July, and have been doing urban retreats, and all of those things are around anti-racism. But I guess the thing that I want to kind of look at is different kinds of mindsets that we kind of take for granted living where we live. We live in the United States, and we kind of have a reputation for being really, like the best democracy on the planet. We actually have that reputation, you realize, right? I'm like, am I wrong? I am not wrong.
That's the propaganda.
People think we have the best democracy on the planet, and we know that that's not actually what we're dealing with here. So there's a mindset there about who and what we are. And I think part of our battle, I love Margaret Mead. Never underestimate the power of a small group of individuals to change society for the better, or something like that. But basically a whole lot of power in a small group, a group this size even, to really make significant change. I don't have any doubt that we can do that. But I do believe that however powerful we may become, it's going to begin with us understanding who and what we really are. This is not a democracy. We haven't had one yet. It's a work in progress, or regress, as the case may be. But the reality is that it's something that we're trying to build. And if we don't think that we do have a democracy, we will go a lot further. And unfortunately, I think the dominant mindset is that, oh, this thing is working. In spite of all the voter suppression we saw in the last election, the outright stolen election in Georgia, and how many more were there? We don't know. Who's counting the votes? We don't know. So, and I'm not going to get into all the problems with the electoral process itself, the electoral college. So that's not the point. I think, though, that we really have to be thinking about how we can educate people about who and what we really are. This is not a democracy. So working on that is, I think, we're the worst performing non-voters of any democracy. We can't, any statistic, we come up really in low numbers, right? Really bad. So we've got to get rid of that idea that what we have here is a democracy. Next, so. Then the other thing I think that goes along with that kind of misconception is the idea that we're individuals and that we're separate and that community doesn't matter. We haven't learned how to care about each other, not sufficiently. And I think if something like this is going to become successful, we're going to have to understand our connection to each other much better than we do. You know, before Citizens United, before the Voting Rights Act was gutted, before certain kinds of breakdowns in the immigration system, it was so easy for most of us to think about problems as being over there, right? Those are, well, that's affecting those people. Voter suppression is affecting those people. And, you know, without a better idea of our connectedness, the fact that when you see this kind of tent cities in the desert for immigrants and don't understand that that's coming for you, if you don't get that, we don't care enough about each other, you know? It has to start with being willing to care about what's happening to people before the house is on fire, right? So, and that lack of understanding what community is and how to care about each other, you know, that's one of the biggest blinders of being effective, right? So we are what we have, you know, when it comes to, well, what have we got? How are we going to make this work? It's we. It's a we. There's a community thing there that's missing. And that comes a lot from this idea of individualism and that we're not, you know, just take a minute and think about, wait, how long have I been talking?
Keep going.
No.
You're on a roll.
I'll just make one more point. Just take a minute and think about how many different people were involved in your getting here today that you never saw and who will probably never be compensated. Probably the clothes you wear, the car you drove, the gas you put in it, the road that you drove on, all of these resources that we're using, that's a we thing. You know, none of us got here on our own today. So we have to redevelop what it means to be in community and to care about each other. And I think this is a really good shot, but it's not a good shot if we don't fix some of these mindsets. You know, it's not a good shot if we don't understand that we have to show up for each other, you know, because we have to fix that sense of powerlessness that comes from actually thinking you are working in a democracy. You can't empower yourself if you think you've already got it, right? Yeah. So we have to fix some of this stuff. And I didn't want to, I just want to say one more thing, just one more. And I just can't stress enough how important it is for us to understand how class and race impacts that inability to deal with what a community should look like. We think we've done this work, we have not done this work, okay? And think about how not doing that work perpetuates institutions that keep us where we are, you know? If we're gonna change anything, we have to change our minds first.
Hi, I'm Miriam Timmer-Hackert, and I've been involved with various boards and groups, peace groups, environmental groups, equality groups, women's rights groups. And what I really like about Move to Amend is that it seems to focus on root issues that can solve all the problems, because it can be really overwhelming. Like, do I want to work on the slaves who are harvesting my chocolate? Do I want to work on saving salmon? Do I want to work on saving the dolphins? Like, you know, and then there's climate change, and there's all these little things that we can divide and be one issue things. But if we can solve the problem of corporations having too much power in our democracy, it will be so much easier to solve so many of these problems that we have. And so I really find this a hopeful thing. And also, if we find out who's shoving people in the stream, then we don't have so many people we have to pull out of the stream. So to some degree, I'm very hopeful that we can work on this, that this will be a solution for us. And I want to say that here in Iowa, we actually have a really strong constitution. We have a strong history of our Supreme Court of Iowa saying we're going to do the right thing. We are a government of the people, for the people, people being equal here in Iowa. So this might be new to some of you, but that line up there is pretty depressing. But if you look at Iowa's Supreme Court history, we started off saying, no, we're not going to return slaves as property because people are people. And we started off, 150 years before the nation decided this. We decided, no, you can't tell black people and white people that they can't marry. That's not the kind of society that Iowa is. We're going to desegregate our schools 100 years before the nation does. We're going to give women the right to go to law school. We're really a progressive state. It's in the Constitution. It's in our case law. So the good news is that if this is going to work somewhere, Iowa's got a decent shot. And the good news is that here in Iowa, we have a lot of power because we've already got Democrats coming to ask us what we want to talk about. We've already got Democrats coming to listen to us. And, there's 50 states in the nation, and we are the ones who get to talk to all the candidates and decide which candidates we want to move forward. So we really do have a chance here in Iowa to ask candidates when they come to say, what do you think about corporations having too many rights? That's a question that we get to ask them that they are then going to have to answer. And we can judge them on their answer, and we can talk to all of our friends and say, this is an issue that needs to be high on our voting priority list. We need to have candidates who care about people's rights and not candidates who just care about corporation rights. We need to have more of these candidates who say, I'm not going to take corporate money. It's not perfect, but it's a starting point. If we say we're not going to vote for candidates who get a whole bunch of corporate money, that's one way we can kind of do this on our own. If we can get everybody to do that, if we can get everybody to say, I'm not going to buy food that's not labeled GMO, then that's kind of our workaround. If the state's not allowed to regulate it, we have to do it ourselves. But I really want to encourage us all here in Iowa to educate each other, to share what you know with each other, and to keep each other positive, because we can make progress, but we can't get overwhelmed. And it's really tough recently not to get overwhelmed with all that's going wrong in the world. But we here in Iowa, we have a lot of power. We have a progressive state constitution. We have progressive case law history. And I think that we can make some changes. Going for questions now?
Well, great. Can I stand so we can be seen?
Yeah.
So that's enough sort of coming from us. Here's an opportunity now for you to kind of go at it. So questions, comments, concerns, consternations, whatever the case may be. And I should say, by the way, just sort of a footnote, you did have a candidate that responded to questions about what he thought about corporations. Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
Right in this state, responded. Remember that?
Corporations are people too, my friend.
That's right. So you're off to a good start.
Somebody says that, we all
That's
have to start
right.
laughing hysterically.
So you're off to a good start in getting these candidates. So why don't we take sort of a list here, maybe 1, 2, anybody else, 3. Remember your number, and maybe just in case other people don't know who you are, say who your name, as well as your question, as well as who you want to direct your question or comments to.
Margaret Schweier, I'm from Fairfield.
And while you're doing that, I'm going to be passing around some.
Okay.
Loved all the comments, it was great. I have several questions. The first question is, and anybody who wants to address it can address it. I like the idea of changing the mindset. That is a big job, and I'm open to any suggestions on how we do that. That's my first question. The second question is, and I love the whole concept of move to amend, love it. I don't see how it's going to affect public financing. I think public financing of elections is another route to go. I'd like to see that happen. I don't know that this necessarily happens along with move to amend. And improvement in corporate governance so that shareholders have more say and have more education as to what the corporation that they own stock in is doing. Because I think most owners of stock or mutual funds are about 99% ignorant about that. So that's it.
Wants to take a stab at that? Any of those concerns, elements?
I would address mindsets.
Please.
I think there are a lot of really good practices coming into communities that weren't getting the kind of attention they deserved. One person I really like, and I know most people here have heard of him, is Richard Wolff, Democracy at Work, but the co-op movement. And then there's communities for, what is this? Community rights.
Oh, yeah.
Community rights.
Legal Defense Fund.
Yeah, yeah.
SOTA.
Yeah, that, I think that putting that emphasis on empowering communities is really important, because I personally don't have any faith in the Democratic Party. I don't have any faith in a two-party system. And I think that we're at a place with the decline of capitalism right now where there's a very desperate grab for what resources are left. And so there's a kind of critical turning point right now where we need to start putting the power in our hands. And we need to start looking to each other as our leaders. We need to be looking at the people who are helping really make real change as our leaders, and stop thinking that Washington is a place we need to appeal to. Because, and I think that does change mindsets, because people can be empowered by seeing it in action.
Thank you.
I could address the clean election.
You want to pass the microphone down?
We have this one too.
So about 10 years ago, there was a movement in Iowa for a clean election bill, and it was getting some progress. And then the Democratic Party at the time had the what they call the trifecta, and Chet Culver had been elected governor, and the Democrats had control of the House and the Senate, and we were very, very hopeful that we could pass a clean election law, because they had passed a few others around the state that would, clean election law would basically publicly finance elections and level the playing field, and we were very, very hopeful. But then we met with Chet Culver's people, and they had literally no interest in that, because what they said is that well, they thought they would put them at a disadvantage because it did not eliminate self-funding. So rich people could finance their own elections. They could opt out of the system. And therefore, people like Mitt Romney or Fred Hubbell could finance when somebody else then took public financing of elections. If the other party didn't, they would then, you put yourself at a disadvantage. And the only thing that they were interested in, and you may not know this, there are no limits, campaign contribution limits in the state of Iowa, unless it's a federal election. The federal House and Senate races and even presidential have so many limits of how much you can give per cycle, and that's for a primary and then for the general election. But in Iowa, there's no such thing exists. So if Stuart Adelson wanted to come in and put $10 million or $1 billion behind Kim Reynolds, he could do it. It would be not probably wise, but so it got no traction then, and then this was in 2006 to 2008 in that era. And then when did Citizens United get passed, Greg?
2010.
2010. So that was at the time he was getting out of office. Well, if you couldn't get the Democrats when they had full control up in Des Moines to do that, then that was our best hope for that. And I think that it's time to address that again. The problem has gotten worse and not better. And just one thought about, you were talking about rights and voting rights in a corporation. I mean, yeah. So, yeah, I've had a little bit of stock, and I get voting rights, and you get all these packets, but a lot of times you also get a thing that you can give somebody your proxy. I would never give anybody my proxy. So if you own stock in a company, even if it's one share, never give away your proxy. And you're allowed to go to their annual meeting and stand up and have your say. But usually that corporation, somebody else has a controlling interest in that corporation, and you will be outvoted. But
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's that one of the hopeful things again is that organizations like the University of Iowa, the big retirement funds, the churches that have a lot of money invested, a lot of these groups have started saying, we're going to pay attention. And that seems to me a powerful enough group that can get stuff done. the Presbyterians divest from Israel, that makes an impact. And I think that that's one of those things that, like, the corporations are going to see the writing on the wall and are going to say, you know, all we have to do is get a couple of these victories, and I think the corporations are going to realize that, yeah, this is an area where people can get back control, can wrest control. So I'm hopeful that that will continue to be a way that we can curb at least the worst of corporate violations, human rights violations.
Just real quick. You know, on the question of, you brought up three things, question of public financing. Be great if we could have mandatory public financing, but we can't, because money is speech. So all of these public financing schemes out there, Maine's got something, Arizona has something, a variety of other communities have, you know, at least partial for the Supreme Court and all. They have to be voluntary. You can't make them mandatory because money is speech. So until we get at that, through constitutional amendment, all you can do is just ask people kindly whether they'll do this. On the issue of, you know, basically changing the mindset or changing the culture, if you will, extremely important. If you look at what the descriptor, the title of this event was, We the People versus Corporate Rule, it's up to us. Move to Men's focus is not really on the Supreme Court, corporations, Congress, regulatory agencies. It's on us. It's got to be on us. Because unless we change, there's a corporate anthropologist, part of POCLAD, Jane Ann Morris. She wrote a piece called Help, I've Been Colonized and I Can't Get Up. Go to her website, democracythemepark.org. Great website title. democracythemepark.org. You can read that article. It's all about decolonizing our minds, because we tend to think what's going on is inevitable, irreversible. It's like gravity. It's like the tides coming in. It's like sunspots. We can't do anything. Pardon my French, that's bullshit. What's gone on has been intentional and deliberate. Just as something has been intentionally done, it can be intentionally undone. But for that to happen, we have to have a different mindset, and it's got to be one that understands that from the start we had an imperfect democracy. We never had one. It's not like, oh, let's go back to some grand glorious. Who was a person to begin with? White, male, property owners, about 5%, 5 to 8%. So we've never had, not like, let's go back, never had a legit one. We need to focus on trying to not just get rid of money, poly, corporate constitutional rights. That's why I Move to Amend. When we try to get groups going, at the very beginning, everybody's got to go through something called a movement education program that talks about democracy, deals with race, class, misogyny, all of these isms that we got to get on the other side of the learning curve and on the culture understanding curve. Otherwise, we're not going to get there. Not going to get there. All right, number 2, I think. Oh, she left. Oh, I'm sorry. 3.
At the risk of raising an unpopular point, I'm going to suggest that we don't have a democracy, nor do we want one. In as much as democracy is 4 wolves and a sheep deciding what they have for dinner. We want, and we are guaranteed by the Constitution, a representative republic. And I'm glad that Amita mentioned the question of class, because right now, everybody who's putting food on the table is glad to ride on the coattails of the 1%. And the next 30 years, 80% of the jobs in the United States are going to disappear. And the 70% of people who are putting food on the table now is going to reduce down to 30%. And those 30% are going to cling to their jobs and to the 1% desperately until we can incorporate them in the learning process. Because the learning process we have been affected by actually started back in the last third of the 19th century with public education. The literacy rate in the Northeast was higher before public education than it was after. And the literacy rate has been going down ever since. So we've got to participate in one another's education and de-indoctrination about letting the experts run the government.
Right. Anybody want to respond to that? And while you're doing it, again, those sheets that went around, I'm sorry. It's an exercise in shameless self-promotion. Okay, move to amend. We don't get the money from big corporations, entities, whatever. We get it from people we work with. So if you can help us out, either one-time contribution or even better, there's a place on there you can check off to be a sustainer, even $5 a month, that'd be great. But also, if you're interested, there has been some move to amend work here in the area. If you want to help in trying to resuscitate that or rethink doing that, there's a place to check off or any other way to support. So I'll pass around, not a hat, but a box. Feel free to throw in your envelope.
While-
Fill that form.
While
Go ahead.
he's doing that, in
Go
the
ahead,
case
respond.
of democracy, number 2 questioner has been waiting in the back, so I thought at least she should be able to voice her concern.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right, so anyone want to respond?
Yeah, I like the very clear analogy that, like, you know, we have someone who's holding 99 of the cookies. He puts one cookie on the table and then he says, don't let the immigrant steal your cookie. And we really do need to get to the point where we say we need to equitably divide the world's resources between everyone. We need to give everyone basic health care, everyone, you know, basic education and so forth. And so to some degree, it's so frustrating that they try to divide us on racial lines, they try to divide us on immigration lines and so forth like that. And so I think it's really powerful to have a movement focused on building community first so that we can't be divided, and that we can focus our anger where it should be on the 1% and getting a more equitable distribution.
Right. You know, this last election, we have a president now that a lot of people don't agree with, but he was, I mean, a lot of people out there are hurting, and they were looking for somebody to blame, and he gave them someone to blame, and mostly it was the immigrants, where they really should have been focusing their energy and maybe their hatred, and I hate to use that when we talk about love and community, but the real people to blame were Wall Street, the corporations, the insurance companies, you name it, healthcare. You know, privatized healthcare is immoral, and we need to get away from that. And but we have the opportunity here in Iowa, the blessed opportunity to be first in the nation. And if we do our job right, and a lot of Iowans really care about this, we will ask all of the, I've identified 38 potential candidates on the Republicans or on the Democratic side, and I think that a couple people might primary our president on the Republican side. Ask them these questions. The questions you're asking us, you should ask them and get their answers. And then if Iowa does its job correctly, we can push somebody forward that wins Iowa that agrees with this on some of these issues. So as we move forward, and the caucus season has already started, there are 3 identified and announced candidates on the Democratic side, and a whole bunch of people are going to be making that decision actually within the next month. So I know we have a never-ending political cycle now in the state of Iowa, but I think that's important, and we have that awesome responsibility, and we need to take it seriously.
All right, other questions?
Oh, I just wanted
sure.
to make one quick response also to the gentleman's comment about where our intelligence is or isn't at this point in time. Part of that also is a budgetary process based on serving corporate interests. Coming from the university, we know that our research institutions are being gutted to service of corporate interests. Who cares if you're educated in citizenship or in any sense of community social responsibility if you're not serving corporations? And so we've watched our educational system be gutted from preschool on up. And so that is very much tied to our sense of what is government's purpose, who is it to serve, and how does it do that? Our budget is what underlies all of our regulatory processes. And if our money is going to be given away to corporations, we are not going to serve the needs of the people. And so we do have to pay some attention to where we're making those choices and how those choices are being made.
All right, another round of...
Robin, you had a question? Did you?
Yeah, actually, I have a comment, and I'd like to make it and pick up on Maureen's reminder to us about how our money gets spent and used. Since 2008, in the great financial debacle that our country and the world experienced, I've been interested in a phenomenon called public banking. I don't know how many of you have heard of public banking, but it is a bank that is owned by a governmental entity, for a municipality, a county, a school district, the state. The one extant example of a public bank is in North Dakota. The Bank of North Dakota was begun in 1919 because the banks in Minneapolis were giving farmers in North Dakota a really bad time. And so the farmers got together and established a bank, which floundered a bit until the mid-20s when bankers got hold of it. They were able to maintain the statewide scope, but modified it in ways that didn't threaten the private sector so much. And that included making commercial banks sort of the front offices for the public bank. So that the Bank of North Dakota is able to finance infrastructure, able to make loans to municipalities, able to make student loans, able to finance economic development. They've been doing this for almost a century now, and they've been able to return about $30 million a year to the state from their profits or their surpluses, if you will. And so the interest, the state uses the bank as its depository. It's required by law to use that bank as its depository for all taxes, fees, and so on. And then it's able to make loans supported by those deposits. And a municipal bank works like any other. It takes deposits, it makes loans, and of course it makes money on the difference between how much it pays for the deposits and how much it charges for the loans. So a municipal bank in Iowa City, for example, could purchase the bonds that Iowa City is currently paying 4, 5, 6% interest on, refinance those at 1% or 1.5%, and then at the end of the year turn over whatever interest has been made to the city itself, just retaining enough to pay for the operation of the bank. Similar, so a municipally owned bank, I'm getting to how this ties into move to amend.
And compared to Wells Fargo, which is where our state now puts its money.
Well, to use another example quickly, the city of Cedar Rapids has reserves around between $250 and $300 million. And the biggest chunk of that is deposited with U.S. Bank, which has won a contract to manage that money for them. And as I've gotten older, I've had difficulty sleeping, but one genuine assured sedative is to read Dodd-Frank, and that will put you to sleep. But fortunately, it did not put me to sleep before I found out that rather than bailing out banks the next time we have a major disaster, we're going to bail in banks. That is that Dawn's deposits in U.S. Bank, if she banks there, would be converted to equity. And so when she brings her IOU to the bank to get her money, they'll say, sorry, you are now part owner in a failed bank. Well, the same thing could happen to a city. Wells Fargo, U.S. Bank is the 5th largest commercial bank in the United States. So when we have our next belly up, and we will, they're more predictable than flooding, and we're going to have more flooding. So at any rate, the way to get at managing our own money and put it under democratic control is to start with municipalities, establish public banks that will be administered by boards appointed by democratically elected officials. That our tax money will be recirculated. It will liberate us from Wall Street. It is the interest that we pay on bonds now goes to goes to investment bankers, and that continues to contribute to the financialization of our economy, and is a big element in the overall philosophy of neoliberalism that we've been under now for, say, more than 30 years. So I would just encourage consideration. This is something we can lobby for on a local level. And our city council people, our county supervisors are readily accessible by us, and we can speak to them about this and encourage them at least to undertake a study. The City of Los Angeles City Council unanimously embraced a study that was made on their behalf, put it before their electorate this past November on short order. They had but 4 months to educate people and had a very sparse budget to do that. But 43% of those who voted to approve a change in the city charter that would permit public banking. This is on a first go. Some 3 million people know more now about public banking than they did 4 months ago. So I commend public banking to your consideration.
And how can, where do people learn more about?
Oh, okay. There are, if you all go to YouTube, just search public banking. A woman named Ellen Brown will be among those who pops up. And she's written a couple of books, one called The Web of Debt, that lays the foundation for thinking through public banking. The other is The Public Bank Solution, which documents how to go about establishing a public bank, where there are existing public banks that may be emulated. Germany, for example, the powerhouse economy in the EU, has had public banks for years, the Sparkassen. So go to YouTube, search public banking. You can check out Ellen Brown's books.
Her web address is also webofdebt.com, I think.
And there's also a website called the Public Banking Institute, which she established in 2011. About 20 communities in the United States right now have consideration of public banking, have studies going on, or something of that sort. So in 2011, she's been able to make that kind of advance. And so the more people that we can get interested will help us get money will refocus money in public life so that we are controlling democratically how the money is used. Thank you. I'm sorry I took so long.
You know, your Constitution, original, 1846, had a section of banking associations, Section 5. Get this. No act of the General Assembly authorizing or creating corporations or associations with banking powers, nor amendments thereto shall take effect or in any manner be in force, unless the same shall have been submitted separately to the people at a general or special election as provided by law. So you want to create a bank? Any kind of private banking corporation in Iowa in your original Constitution, okay, but that can't be done just by a legislative act. It's got to go before the general public. That was a form of democratic control then. Okay, I think there and then here.
Thank you all. This has been really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot. And I just wanted to add to what Danita said. I just think this idea of American exceptionalism is just central to the propaganda system in this country. The idea that we have this wonderful democracy, our government, our corporations never do anything wrong. And I think, learning to care more about ourselves and make community locally also needs to be true of realizing we're part of a global community. And we can't, and they want us to not know what our corporations and our government are doing to hurt people around the world by just, so people don't listen, they don't believe it, and then the media doesn't talk about it. You can't be part of a country whose war industry is killing 1 million people around the world all the classism and the racism and all the violence against women that involves. And I think it's not going to come back to us, and it is coming back.
Chicken's coming home to
And
roost.
the same thing is true of the state of Iowa. Until you admit Iowa's role, you are sitting here being the problem. I can tell you there's no woman allowed into law school here who's serious. And I could go on for half an hour about that. And pretending these things are not happening does not mean, I don't know where you're an activist. And that is to the last person. Everything that the person said before you, it couldn't have been more inaccurate. And I don't know how you could even say that you are proud of this state. There are T-shirts that say, "Dear America, I'm sorry about Grassley." What does that mean? Branstad is hiding out in China and can't go anywhere. What does that mean? And you're sitting here saying Iowa is a great place. Do you think people would be here if they weren't trapped and not able to sleep and eat? That is not a game. And you are treating it like a game.
So, before she responds, I just want to remind everybody that so far we've been really respectful to each other, and it's not this isn't a call-out thing. I think is what we really want to focus on is where we can have a beneficial conversation. And I think so. Do you want to come into the room and sit down, for example?
I'm trying to wait to talk to someone about something so I don't have to do this.
Right, because it's a little bit of a screaming match with you way back there.
Okay, I'll wait. Thank you. As long as you do that.
Other questions?
Yeah.
This is a slightly different topic, but I wanted to raise it and ask the panelists. If we had a ranked voting system, how would that change our possibilities of affecting real change? Because you've been talking about the elections, and we do face them. And, of course, eventually, move to amend will have to be involved indirectly in the political process, because it is a desire to change the Constitution. So I wonder if you could speak to the effect that being able to have multiple parties in the state of Iowa and in the United States would have on the political process.
Are you talking about ranked choice voting?
Yes.
Oh.
Sometimes it's called instant runoff voting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Be great.
Yes.
Yeah, currently we have a two-party system where you only have two choices, and so a lot of us feel like you have to vote against the worst party, and that's, it'd be really nice if you could have more than two choices. If we could have lots of parties represented in our state legislature so that people would form coalitions and work together and not see it as an us versus them, but see it as, these groups are able to work together to make progress.
That's
The
right.
state of Maine has instituted this.
Yeah.
It doesn't operate for every single state office for various reasons, but it has begun somewhere in the United States. And
No,
it has
yeah.
it is used in several other countries.
Well, it also exists at the municipal level. I mean, while state of Maine is the first state, there is that system that exists, I think, in about 24 municipalities around the country.
Part of what frustrates multi-party voting is that in Iowa, you're required to have a runoff election. And so that prevents the instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting.
I saw a question over in the back.
Yep.
Did the other questions get answered?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
I'm looking around the room, and I see we're individuals of a certain generation or generations. And I'm just not really sure this is a question, but two comments. One, Iowa is in a big mess right now, and I think we all know that. It's been one thing after another, eroding our political control, our rights of women, et cetera, to protect the environment. So things are a mess in Iowa. I was talking with my partner this morning. We were talking about things we could do together for us to build a stronger relationship. And a lot of them we can no longer do in Iowa. So I've said enough of that. Going outside is a problem in Iowa. Getting clean food is a problem. Lots of problems. But the other thing that I started with is thinking about who's in this room. And I know that a lot of us in this room have been working on issues that we've talked about since the 60s, 70s, 80s. I think something we need to do is to get these messages out to younger people. I'm not saying we shouldn't share it with each other, one another, our friends, our colleagues, our same age group. I would just suggest that we were, I don't know, naive or bold enough in the 60s and 70s to say, hey, you want to come talk to a class of junior high about women's issues, gender issues, and since we're there, we can talk about class and race also. At that time, we were leading with women's issues, but we were not at all shy about bringing the issues I mentioned in. I think that needs to happen now. I don't know what is taking us so long. It wasn't hard then. We just went to the teacher, we went to the school, and we said, we'd like to make a presentation. This time it could be on the Constitution, our democracy, however you want to frame it, in a way that you get a foot in the door, and then we do it.
West High is asking for speakers.
High schools, we talked to, I don't know, maybe elementary, college classes.
West High right now, since she brought it up, I said I would help advertise. West High for MLK Day is asking for people to come and talk with their students. And they have devoted the entire day to community speakers coming into West High. And if anybody wants that information, just leave me your email and I'll send it out to you. I'm giving 2 talks on militarism and social justice, the intersections, because that was where MLK ended his career, basically. Short-circuited. But a lot of issues that Martin Luther King stood for could be developed during that day by people here who are interested in speaking to these issues.
And that is a great start. Circling around to the issue of caring for each other and how we manage to hurt ourselves. I'm going to just take a risk and say through identity politics and amongst the people I was working with in the 60s and 70s and not together as a larger community. I don't know how we work together anymore. I mean, people can be so cranky.
Hold the mirror up, hold the mirror up. Yeah, absolutely. I want to respond to that. I want to respond to that because we just did a freedom school. And when I was a kid, I went to a freedom school, right? And I think it...
Does everybody know what a freedom school is?
Well, you know, in '64, they had 41 freedom schools in Mississippi to make the political process there integrated so that black people could vote, they could register, they could organize, they held conferences that for the first time they started to reflect back their own power to each other. And that was because hundreds of people went into Mississippi and held these freedom schools, and they were these 3 or 4 day, 2-week schools depending on the circumstances where community issues were brought into and put on the front and center. Cultural icons were taught about, black history was taught about, voting rights were taught about. Anyway, I could say more. But we had a 4-day one here in Iowa City over the summer. And we spent the 4th day of it at the Meskwaki lands. And the issue was, you know, being in alignment with values that recognize that we're on stolen land. we have a lot of work to do, and that's.
What ages?
Well, these were all adults because we only had we had 7 youth enroll, and then it went down to 4, so we didn't do the youth program. But I think you're right. The Freedom School I went to was all youth, but this community did not get behind that school. And I have to say that because we had about 40 adults attend, but where were the kids? So what is going on in this community where we're not looking at the need for this, you know? So we have to address those questions too. I love the idea of going to public schools and talking, but I also think the public schools are, what are they fucking doing? I mean,
They're becoming.
Preparing for tests.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I just have
You're
no
becoming more
confidence.
corporate.
And the comment this man made earlier about what the schools are doing is really important.
that's right.
We need to think about, somebody commented the other day, they're not going to teach us how to overcome what they're putting us through.
Your
So,
entire job for the last 80 years has been indoctrination.
Yep.
No, the last 100 years.
right, so we also need freedom schools. We need to go into the schools and we need freedom schools.
So I'd like to address a few things. Thanks, Eric, some great questions. In the last year, I have been to North Central Junior High, West High, Clear Creek, Amana, and City High at the invitation of individual teachers to come in and talk, mostly government classes and stuff. So there are really great teachers that are encouraging that sort of stuff, and most of these kids aren't old enough. But here's another issue. Maureen wants us to, and I'd probably like to go out on Martin Luther King Day, but why is the Iowa City Community School District actually having school on Martin Luther King Day? That's a question I want to ask. When that's a national holiday, well, we should be actually.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay.
It's
But
for.
the last few years, they've actually had that controversy here in Iowa City about having school on that particular day. And I think we have some teachers in the audience that could probably back that up. But to me, that should be a day of service for people in the community. And, they say, well, we're going to, teach a little bit about this, that, and the other thing. But it's very, very little, and it's really just another day of school where it shouldn't be. And in identity politics, I'm sorry, I think that we've gone maybe a little bit too far with identity politics because people that are really strong on issues are getting voted out because of identity politics. I happen to be an upper middle class, middle-aged, straight white guy. That's not a good thing to be on the ballot this year.
Well, I'm not even going to, you know what, I have to.
Okay, go ahead.
I have to say this, I have to, because look, okay, identity politics have run off the rails.
Yeah.
It's true, but it's not that white males are suffering because of that. The problem that is happening with identity politics is that people forget what the strategic element was. It isn't to divide us. It isn't to get a politically correct cudgel to beat people over the head with. Identity politics developed to build solidarity and cross-community education. So in other words, your social location help people understand about what it means to be a trans person, what it means to be a gay person, what it means to be a black person, and what are the political issues surrounding that particular community. Not as a way to say, there's something wrong with you because of, my identity not being properly respected. What we need to take a step back and do is to look at the ways in which all of our subject positions, wherever we find ourselves in society, have something to teach us about power and the abuse of that power, and whether it's serving our democracy or not, whether it's serving our communities or not. That is a common issue that identity politics was developed to actually overcome, so that we could forge that solidarity. Ignorance was a problem. And so it was about understanding each other. It has gone off the rails. I've been beat over the head as a black woman with identity politics, and I'm gay, Buddhist, I'm not even a Christian, and so I understand, but I don't think that white males are actually getting the short shrift here. Which isn't to say that,
I wasn't trying to generalize that white males were getting it.
You mean
I
you
said,
personally?
Me personally. I'm an ally. I'm the best ally that
No,
most
Mike, you have been, but I just don't, when it comes to where,
Yeah.
we have to stop this
Yes,
conversation.
exactly.
But, okay.
We need to, we're a little bit off
All
track.
right, I just want to probably have time for one more question, but before doing that, I just wanted to acknowledge, excellent question about the intergenerational, figuring out how we can make this intergenerational. Move to Amend is trying to very consciously do that. Toward that end, we have something called caucuses, where we have people who are focused on trying to intentionally, deliberately reach out to certain constituents. We have 4 caucuses. A labor caucus, believing that's pretty important, working with labor unions, working people. An interfaith caucus that reaches out to people of faith and ethical concerns, so there's people who are connected to humanist organizations that are part of this. A educators caucus, it's made up of teachers and trying to get students involved. And an arts and culture caucus, realizing that, hey, artists out there have been on the cutting edge of many movements of the past. We need to make sure that we have spoken word and art in all forms, paintings and the like, that are trying to express issues of democracy, self-governance, sovereignty, whatever you want to call it. So that's very important. And toward that end, as part of this tour that I'm on, tomorrow I'm going to Augustana College, and then Tuesday there's a junior high school in Liberty, I don't know what the school is, that's focusing on, it just so happens, the Constitution. And I'm taking that timeline, speaking to 4 classes. I don't know how I'm going to do it, in the morning, and then doing the Cedar Rapids program in the evening. So, agreed, there are teachers out there, we just need to connect. Problem, though, is, at least at a college level, you don't see as many sort of student organizations that you used to. Why? They're out there trying to pay for their tuition. I mean, they're having to hustle and work one job or more, or you've got the administration, particularly at public schools, high schools, that are much more top-down, that are much more protective of outside people coming in than, relatively speaking, there used to be. It used to be far easier to get into public schools than it is. All right, maybe one more question, then we wrap it up.
So I want to thank all of you, because this has really been a very lively and wonderful crew to come here. I just wanted to offer one thought, and as I'm sitting here listening to you, I'm very aware of this kind of interesting division in terms of work that needs to be done. And on one hand, there's the work that needs to be done to pass laws, to change the structure of our government so that it works better. And on the other level, we have a real issue of community building, and how do we go about doing that? And when I have been watching, of course, the last election cycles, one of the things that really hit me very hard is that the way that we make political decisions is, it's a very terrible way to be making decisions, because we're faced with very complex problems that involve, if we're going to really find a decision, we really have to mine the experience and expertise of many, many parts of our vast society. And we don't have a way right now to do that dialogue. The political process, where you have this oversimplifications of the problems, where you have so much competition, where people are like, it's like a little war, and nobody, and we don't even have a way of holding truth and real feedback loops, getting that in there. And I don't see how we can have a democracy unless we start working with that. And I just in my little research of this, I have run across a man by the name of Jim Ruff, who has written a couple books, and they're using some of his methods now over in Europe, of a way of having community discussions that involve all of these kinds of things, that you can do it in small groups and bigger groups. I am sorry, I cannot remember the name of his wonderful website, and I cannot remember the name of his book, but if
How do you spell his last name?
Ruff, R-U-F-F.
Thanks.
But if any of you would give me your name and your email, I would send you links. I'd be happy to send you links. Because you know, we're facing this time, and as I look at it, I go, this system has to be changed from the bottom up.
Yeah.
We are so out of contact with life. We are so out of contact with the planet, with each other. The change is so enormous. We have to have a really new way of doing things. Really new.
That's right.
And nobody knows how to do that right now. And when I was reading the kinds of things, because he started off in business and working with very contentious groups, and he has this wonderful way of holding these meetings in a way that really mine the creativity of all the people and get them to start connecting with each other and to start hearing actually the complexity of the problem that they have to deal with. I think if democracy is going to work, I think we really have to start looking in that direction.
Yeah.
So I just want to offer you that because I know a lot of people don't know about his book, but if you give me a card or something, a way to contact you, I will send you the links.
Maybe that's a good comment to sort of end on. And so toward that end, thank you ever so much for coming. Thank you again to Dawn for sort of helping organize this and working with others. To the co-sponsors, there's some wonderful refreshments in the back, some great materials in the back. Pick up some of the swag and propaganda on the Meet to Men table. There's a thing I put together called a Real Democracy History Calendar. If you're trying to get on the other side of the learning curve of this stuff, it goes out once a week. It's free, sent to your email box every Monday morning. Pick one of these up and subscribe. And for that, thank you so much.
Thank you.